I just want to say apologies about the mix-up earlier. I had some car trouble this morning and did not get back in time to get going. But thanks again for Taylor for jumping in and switching us up on the agenda. So this morning, we're going to be talking about placement in least restrictive environment. My name is Tate Ball. I'm Associate Counsel for Special Education with the department, and I'm here today joined by Robert Taylor, one of our IDEA complaints investigators. Rob, you want to say hello?
Hi, everybody. It's a big crowd out here. I'm glad that I'm safely in a virtual setting. Otherwise, I'd be a little bit scared. It's good to see you all.
So why are we going to talk about LRE today? As we know, there's been a rise in behavioral issues around not just Tennessee, but across the entire United States. So while it can seem prudent in the moment to maybe place a problematic student in a more restrictive environment, segregating them from their classmates, it's not always the correct choice for that student's educational journey. So today we want to try to give you the tools to help you make those decisions and do that in the correct process as you document along the way. First off, IDEA does set out that special classes, separate schooling, and other removal of children with disabilities from regular educational environments should only occur when the nature and severity of the disability is such that the education in a regular classroom with use of supplementary aids cannot be achieved satisfactorily. We know it's so important to have kids in these general education classrooms, not just from an academic perspective, but also from socialization. Learning from one's peers, especially at a younger age, is essential for students with disabilities to learn how to function by mirroring their peers. For instance, it's sometimes a lot easier than rather telling a student not to run down the hall for them to see that their peer is not running down the hall and be able to mirror that behavior. So we hope that our presentations today can help shed some light on why LRE is important and making this decision should not be made lightly. But essentially, one key takeaway we want you to have is to document the process the entire way so that when you do have to make those decisions and defend them, that you have the right evidence to be able to do so. So let's go ahead and get started. We've got our disclaimer slide. Again, we can't use generative AI tools for note-taking purposes. I don't think we need to read this again, but let's go ahead with our agenda. So we're going to go ahead and start with sort of what LRE is on a basic level, why it's so important for the kids. Then we'll jump into some concerns we're hearing from advocates around the state, as well as some things you might want to consider when you're making those placement decisions. Then we're going to really hone in on what qualifies for a student to meet that threshold of a disruptive force. Just because a student is disrupting a classroom does not mean that they are what a court would consider a disruptive force, which is one of the three reasons you can move a child to a more restricted environment. And throughout the entire presentation, we're going to have hypotheticals that kind of delve into some case law that's been active in the state recently. We'll have some discussions. Feel free to chime in on the chat, give some questions or responses throughout, and we'll try to get to those as much as possible. So as I said, under IDEA, students should be educated with their non-disabled peers as much as possible to the maximum extent. And those students with disabilities should only be removed from those regular education environments when the student's IEP team determines that the nature and severity of that disability is such that education in those regular classrooms with the use of modifications or supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily.
I'll add a little bit to that. Basically, under IDEA, special classes, separate schools, or other removal of children with disabilities from the regular education environment should occur only when the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in the regular class with the use of supplementary aids and services can't be achieved satisfactorily. So what are some of those supplementary aids and services that might be tried? Questions to ask yourself: can we support the teacher with classroom management? Can we support the student with classroom accommodations? Should we consider a one-on-one aid? Can we support the student with assistive technology? Is there a way we can offer co-teaching or use small doses of pull-out services? And have we conducted an FBA and developed a BIP? Also, have we worked with Triad, which is a resource that's available to everyone? And have we sought parental input? One point about those is the first two that I mentioned, classroom accommodations or training and support for the teacher. Those are things that can be done in classroom wide for support of regular ed and special education or suspected students that are pretty, you get a lot of bang for your buck because you can do that outside of the IEP team decision making process.
Yeah, and all of those things that Rob mentioned, it's great to document those along the way so that when you're making the decision and having to defend it, you can show all the steps that you've taken in that process. So let's go ahead and start with our first hypothetical. A middle school principal is reviewing the placement of a student, Alex, who has severe behavioral challenges, including aggression, verbal outbursts, and elopement. Despite multiple interventions and supports, Alex continues to disrupt the general education classroom and pose safety risks to peers and staff. The IEP team, after conducting a functional behavioral assessment and consulting with a school psychologist, proposes a temporary one-on-one placement to gather more data and help Alex transition to a private setting. Alex's parents opposed this decision, arguing that he should not be placed in a general education classroom with accommodations. That he should be placed in general education classroom with accommodations. They claim his behaviors have improved, but they don't provide any supporting evidence. The school district, on the other hand, relies on data from the FBA, expert testimony, and past reports showing Alex's continued struggles. So if this was challenged in court, do you believe the school district's decision would be upheld under the IDEA's LRE mandate? Just take a couple seconds and think about what your answer would be and why you think it would be that. So the first thing that jumps out to me here is the great job that the school has done about documenting along the way and having hard evidence. So yes, it likely would be upheld. Under that LRE mandate, students should be educated with their peers as much as possible unless the disability is preventing their progress, even with those supports. In Alex's case, the school followed a proper procedure by conducting that FBA, getting data to confirm those ongoing behavioral challenges, consulting with a psychologist. That expert testimony is invaluable when you're presenting that to a court to support that more restrictive placement. Reviewing those prior reports, the documentation showing issues are not improving along the way, and therefore Alex is not making achieving the type of success that you'd expect to see from him. So the parents claim, on the other hand, they said that he improved, but they didn't offer any evidence of it. And courts have to rely on objective data, not just assertions. They can't just be mere words. Since the school's decision is based on that documented need and safety concerns, it would likely be upheld or challenged. And this actually comes from a case that was decided just last month, came out on Valentine's Day, actually, out of Williamson County. A student had a myriad of disorders, and his parents sued Williamson County Board of Education, arguing that the school district had violated the LRE mandate under IDEA by placing him in that one-on-one setting. But the middle district ruled that the student could not actively participate safely in that general education setting, even with the supports. They emphasized that while IDEA prioritizes educating students with disabilities alongside their peers, removal can be appropriate when a student's behavior is significantly disrupting learning or posing safety risks. Ultimately, this decision reaffirmed that the LRE requirement does not prevent schools from placing the students in those more restrictive settings when necessary for safety or educational effectiveness, provided they have sufficient data to justify that decision. And in this instance, the school did a great job of documenting along the way how the student was not making progress on their behavioral goals, was not reaching those IEP goals. They were projected to finish well below those for their annual goals. So the school did a great job of putting the evidence together and making a good case here. So what if, instead of the school requesting a more restricted environment, what do you do if a parent requests a more restricted environment? This is a real life example we got from one of our administrative complaints where the parents had requested a more restrictive environment for the student to be moved to a self-contained behavioral classroom. This was a third grade student that had been having behavioral incidents. 3 consecutive days they had incidents, one of which resulted in an out-of-school suspension. The IEP team met and the district denied a request for more restrictive self-contained behavioral classroom. And so the parent filed an administrative complaint with our office saying that the district had failed to place a student in that confined classroom and therefore did not meet the ongoing educational and safety needs of that student. So in this instance, how much weight would you put as a school district upon the parent's request as opposed to the other evidence? We know, as we mentioned earlier, parental input is important, but is it the end all be all? What do you all think? Give about 10 seconds as you think about this question. So likely the department's decision would be upheld if they supported that denial of the parent's request with strong evidence that the student was still succeeding and achieving as expected towards the grade level standard. Under that IDEA mandate, students should be educated with their peers, again, unless the disability is preventing meaningful progress, even with supports. In this case, the school followed the proper steps by responding to concerns. They added inclusionary services, scheduled breaks, and bi-monthly consultative social work services. They also had documented very well with progress reports, observations from teachers, prior written notices from IEP meetings held several times throughout the year to demonstrate that the team had considered, increased, or adjusted the student services based off the data that they'd received. So it really the school did a good job of showing why they were making a decision and documenting that in a prior written notice when they denied the parent's request for a more restrictive placement. So the department did affirm the district's IEP team decision. The district asserted that the specific program for the behavioral isolation serves students who display consistent and continuous self-injurious behavior or pose a serious risk to the harm of themselves or others. The district did a great job in supporting their belief that the current behaviors of the student did not reach the level, that they were more sporadic and they were age reflective of a third grade student acting out as any third grader would. So, we understand, we can empathize with the parents' request for wanting that more restrictive behavior, but it's not always about what the parent wants. It's about what's best for the kid. And when the team meets and makes that decision, if they're confident in that decision and have the evidence to back it up, that's what's important. And again, this is not an all or nothing decision. At this moment in time, the IEP team believes that a more restrictive environment is not necessary, but that decision can be changed if the data that they continue to gather shows that the student is not meeting those goals later on. So that's just an important thing, to keep that documentation, make that decision, and know it's not just a permanent decision. And even if you do move a student to a more restricted environment, the goal should always be to get them back to that more general education setting if possible. Rob, you want to take this one?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so APR, I'm sure that you all are very aware of what that is. It's about the season for that. Specific to APR Indicator 5, as part of our state performance plan, we've set the following goals and targets for APR. And you can see for Indicator 5A, the percent of students with IEPs who are served in a regular class more than 80% of the day has gone up from a target of 76.06% back in 2023-24 to 78.34% for this year. 5B, the percent of students served with IEPs who are served in regular class less than 40% of the day. The target for that was almost 11% a couple of years ago, and it's down to just over 9 for the 25-26 APR year. And finally, Indicator 5C, the percent of students with IEPs who are served in a separate school, residential facility, homebound placement, or hospital placement. 2 years ago, that was just under 1% at 0.79. And in the current APR year, 25-26, that's decreased down to 0.41%, so even less. We've had some concerns from advocacy groups about students being placed in how LRE is determined for students with disabilities. So in light of that, let's ask ourselves whether we're placing too many students in a general education environment. So this slide reflects more current data, what we just looked at, but looking backward in 2014 and 2015, our Indicator 5A percentage was 70.06, 5B was 10.74, and 5C was 1.79. And we do appreciate that LREs are caught up in that tension between moving or maintaining students in a less restrictive environment and weighing that against behavior concerns that are out there and very evident in schools. So it can be a useful starting point to consider where our state APR targets are for educational environments. And while no particular school district is required to meet these targets, it can be useful to review where you are as a district. So if your percentages are significantly out of alignment with the state's targets, it might be worth reviewing your placement procedures. And remember that approximately 2/3 of students with disabilities in Tennessee fall within 3 disability categories, and those are SLD, specific learning disability, speech language impairment, and other health impairment. And generally speaking, the department expects that most students in those categories should be receiving services in a regular education environment more than 80% of the school day. Okay, next slide, Tate. And I mentioned those concerns from advocates. We hear regularly from advocates, from parents specific to LRE sharing concerns over the years. And looking back at about 2020, there was a concern that BEP funding, the BEP funding model will lead to schools placing students in overly restrictive placements. Up in 2022, there were concerns that additional funding for unique learning needs in TISA will lead to schools placing students in overly restrictive placements. And even more recently, in just last year, what are some challenges from special education, challenges in special education? We asked advocates at the Tennessee Special Education Advocacy Network group, and overwhelmingly they said a high number of students being placed on homebound. We have recently started a series of meetings with special education advocates, and they have been, they've praised and been very supportive and spoken very highly of the willingness of districts to offer more inclusive opportunities, but they've expressed concerns about over-reliance on homebound placements. You may know, if you do, remember that homebound placements also result in a TISA unique learning need multiplier of 150%. So some may think that LEAs have a financial incentive to place students in more restrictive environments, and that's not a new allegation, but it is a concern that advocacy groups, as well as our state General Assembly, have expressed concern about. Best practice is always to have services and goals aligned to returning a student to a less restrictive environment, and it should always be the goal for that student to be returned at some point to a less restrictive environment. Okay, comparing homebound placements. All right, so educational homebound and medical homebound. Only students who are with disabilities are eligible for educational homebound, while both students with disabilities and non-disabled peers are eligible for medical homebound. Excuse me, having some technical difficulties here. Okay, and what services is a student entitled to? Every student's entitled to FAPE. The student's IEP team determines the frequency and duration of instruction necessary for the student to receive FAPE, and FAPE can be different for every student. So it's not necessarily a formula or a one-size-fits-all. The determination of FAPE is up to the student's IEP team. For medical homebound, the student must receive at least 3 hours of instruction per week while school's in session, but they're still entitled to FAPE. The student's IEP team for medical homebound determines the frequency and duration of instruction necessary for the student to receive FAPE, and taking into consideration, of course, the physician's recommendation. What else has to be included in the student's IEP for educational homebound? It's got to contain a goal of returning the student to a less restrictive environment within the school year. The IEP must review the placement at intervals of 30 school days to ensure the appropriateness of the placement and the instruction that's being received while services are being received in that placement. For medical homebound, the IEP team should regularly review the placement to ensure that the appropriateness, to assure that it's still an appropriate placement and that the instruction is appropriate. Both educational homebound and medical homebound, those requirements and obligations are set forth in state board rule, and we have the links that you'll be able to access through the slide when it's made available to you, listed down there at the bottom.
Yeah, I think one thing, Rob, jump in here, that we noticed when we were giving the presentation around the state is Just the big thing to take away here is who's driving the bus on each of these decisions. On the educational homebound, it's going to be the IEP team. And as you can see there, as Rob mentioned, you need to be meeting with it for every 30 school days to make sure that decision is continuing to be appropriate. Versus medical homebound, that decision is being driven by the doctor, the physician, the treating physician. And that IEP team does not have to meet every 30 days, though we did hear from some districts that's what they were doing. That is just the requirement there under state board rule, is that the IEP team needs to meet on regular intervals to review that placement. But that's just something we saw when we were talking around the state.
Okay, so here's a discussion, another hypothetical situation. So you agree to join an IEP team meeting. This is a student who is 5 years old, who has been enrolled in TEIS's extended option since she was 2 years old. Your school psychologist suspects the student may have an intellectual disability, but the student is currently eligible, not surprisingly, under developmental delay. The TEIS case manager has described the student as a handful who is unable to follow directions, routinely throws tantrums, and has had issues with biting adults and peers. So the question is your local education agency required to place that student in a general education classroom? So just think about that for a minute or two, and then I'll give you the best answer. And if anyone wants to be brave and just type yes or no in the chat, one person, what do you think? Okay, team decision, it looks like we got. So that's a good answer. The answer is your local education agency required to place a student in a general education classroom? No, there is no requirement. In a lot of the contact our team has with parents, advocates, and other stakeholders, there does seem to be kind of a misunderstanding out there that it is a requirement to always go general education first as far as a physical placement. But there is no requirement for outside of an IEP team decision to determine LRE. But let's talk about the factors that they might consider while making those decisions. It can be difficult. We do acknowledge that. Some things to consider: if the student's been receiving Part C services through TEIS for the last 3 years. So in this case, you might not have any data to show that what that student's performance would look like in a classroom setting. Second, the student was last evaluated by the school district before the student turned 3 and is 5 now. So there really isn't much current data, if any, about how the student's academic achievement or functional performance, what that looks like. And finally, number 3, the student's needs appear to have changed, not surprisingly, since you last evaluated when the student was 2. Before you can place the student, you may need to consider a reevaluation to see what that student looks like now, conducting an FBA and developing a BIP to support the student's behavioral needs. Remember, the school psych said there are some behavioral needs. And 3, seeing how the student responds to instruction to understand whether those concerns are related to a lack of appropriate instruction or related to the student's disability. And while you go through those processes, you can place the student in a more restrictive environment and work towards moving the student to the general education classroom. You don't ultimately need to place the student in the general education classroom, but you must first consider whether the student could be placed in that general education classroom. So you don't want to have just a process set in stone for all kids start in the most restrictive. You don't need to have a process that says all kids start in regular ed. You want to consider it on a student by student basis based on some of those considerations that I just talked about. In considering that placement, the first thing that you want to consider is can we put the kid this student in the regular education environment? And here in Letter to Cohen, OSEP does not interpret Part B's LRE provision to require that a disabled student actually be placed in the regular education classroom and fail before a more restrictive placement is considered. And sometimes there is the misconception out there that we've got this kid that's going to be very, very challenging. We know from our experience with this student in TEIS, but we have to put them in a regular education classroom and see how it goes and get data to support backing off and making that placement more restrictive. That is not the case. Placement decisions can be based on things other than also where the student will receive the best education. So you don't need to ultimately place a student in the general ed classroom, but you need to first consider whether they could be. Going from TEIS, talking ages 2 to 5, to speaking about students who are older, age as a factor in consideration of placement. What is appropriate placement for a student with a disability will likely depend on the student's age, and courts have generally upheld more restrictive placements for students with disabilities in or nearing high school. Why would that be? At a younger age, like the TEIS student we just spoke about, there's going to be a lack of data. They haven't been exposed to as much academic instruction, to the structure and expectations of a public education placement. Also, importance of socialization is a consideration, especially for kids who are younger and may not have ever been in an academic environment before. And also the importance of programming at an older age. We want to prepare our older students for post-secondary opportunities as much as we can. So if we have a student who's getting late into high school, do we really want to keep a student just for the sake of LRE in an academic placement or receiving services in a placement where he's making minimal progress, when that student might be better served in something to prepare him more for what he is more apt to be successful at in his post-secondary opportunities. So it might be the difference between being able to work a regular job, or maybe it might be a student who needs a supportive living environment after graduation, who may have some type of employment but requires support. So we want the LRE to be aligned for older kids with what their post-secondary plans look like.
All right, so now we can jump into a little bit of law about how you make that decision. So in the Sixth Circuit, where Tennessee is located, the prevailing case law for making the decision about whether a placement in general education is required or not comes from a test called the Rocker case. So it's the Rocker test. Basically, the Rocker approach holds that in a case where a segregated facility is considered superior, the court has to determine whether the services which make that placement superior could be feasibly provided in a non-segregated setting. If they can, then the placement in that segregated setting would be inappropriate under IDEA. So under this approach, as you see on the screen, there's 3 factors for determining when that requirement for being in a general education setting can be overcome. First, whether the disabled student would benefit from inclusion from general education. Typically, LEAs have not been successful in arguing that a student would not receive any educational benefit from a regular education classroom. Benefits are not just synonymous with academic achievement. We can consider other things like behavioral benefits, socialization, things outside of the classroom that help prepare those students for life after school. Courts have generally ruled that students are going to benefit just simply by being around their non-disabled peers. From the second factor that should be considered is whether those benefits from a placement in a regular classroom can be far outweighed by the benefits of special education. Here is where school districts have been much more successful in making an argument. Generally, if you're in a more restricted environment, but the benefits are far outweighing those that you would receive in a normal setting, courts have weighed in favor of the school district's decision there, and the LEAs have had success in arguing that they would be better served in that more restrictive environment. So that's really the column you want to be in. Is the middle is showing with documented evidence, as we talked about earlier, that the student is going to be far better served in those more restrictive environments. Just because a student would likely receive a better education in a more restricted environment, that's not the test. It's that the total amount of benefits will outweigh that. And the third factor would be whether the student is being a disruptive force in class. And we will go into that a little bit more detail in just a moment here, but let's go ahead with another hypothetical first. So Liam, a 5-year-old with autism, attended an inclusive preschool with supports and was making good progress. When transitioning to kindergarten, the school proposed placing him in a self-contained classroom for most of the day, arguing that the general education setting was too fast-paced. His parents disagreed, citing his success in preschool with appropriate supports. Parents challenged the school's decision, claiming that the school violated the IDEA's LRE mandate by failing to consider whether he could succeed in that general education classroom with accommodations. Do you think the parent's claim would succeed? Give me a couple seconds here. Yes, it likely would. The school's decision would be overturned. Courts have ruled that a self-contained placement was inappropriate because a student in this situation previously had succeeded in an inclusive setting with supports and services. So making those LRE decisions does require effort. Schools must first attempt to make those accommodations in general education setting before resorting to those more restrictive placements. It's not about convenience for schools. Schools need to modify the general education setting and services whenever possible instead of defaulting to a more segregated environment. And this comes from a case from 2023 out of Knoxville, where Knox County Schools Sixth Circuit ruled that they violated the IDEA by placing the kindergarten with autism in a more self-contained classroom instead of general education. The child had made progress in an inclusive preschool with supports, but the district argued that the kindergarten was too fast-paced. And just to remind you, as I said earlier, the importance of hard objective evidence to courts. And just saying that a kindergarten setting is too fast-paced, that's more of an assertion, and that's not something that a court can strongly rely on without evidence, especially when confronted with the fact that the student had achieved in an inclusive setting with additional services. So the court applied the Ronker test here and found that the district had failed to prove that the child could not succeed in that general education setting with those accommodations. Schools need to try all reasonable supports before removing a student from those inclusive settings because of all the benefits we've talked about earlier from a student being in the general education population, especially at a young age, like in this instance. So this case reinforced that the LRE decisions require effort and creativity, and schools cannot just default to those more restrictive placements just for out of convenience. They have to modify general education whenever possible to make those general education settings accommodate them to the best ability for the students. And now we can talk a little about what is a disruptive force. Not to minimize the difficulty of schools and teachers' jobs, but courts have generally held that a student can be moved to a more restrictive placement when the student is interfering based off if one of the following three things is true. So first, the student's behavior is interfering with the learning of other students because the student is demanding so much of the teacher's time and attention, therefore taking that time and attention away from the rest of the classroom. The obligation is to make FAPE not available just to the student with disabilities, but FAPE needs to be available to every student in the classroom. And that can mean, that moving a student to a more restricted environment for a period of time would be beneficial and meeting that obligation for FAPE for all students. A second possibility is if the student's behavior is interfering with the learning of other students because it is too much of a distraction to a classroom. And this is not an isolated or sporadic incidents. This should be a pattern of disruption, not just causing the class clown, causing people to laugh, but perhaps an instance where the entire classroom has to be evacuated while a student deals with an emotional or behavioral issue. And that leads to the third potential factor, which would be if the student's behavior is threatening the safety of either the other students or themselves if placed in that regular classroom. So these are the three instances that courts have found for meeting that threshold of when a student becomes a disruptive force and can therefore, under the Ronker test, be moved to a more restricted environment for at least a period of time until they're able to move back to that general education setting if possible. So here's a hypothetical to deal with disruptive force narrative. So Emma, an 11-year-old student with Down syndrome, is in a general education classroom with 20 minutes of special education supports per day. Despite multiple interventions, she struggles with behavioral outbursts, including hitting classmates and pulling hair. The school proposes a new IEP to place Emma in a special education setting for 4 hours per day, arguing that she's not making progress and is disrupting the classroom. Her parents disagree, insisting that she should stay in a general education setting with additional accommodations. They file a lawsuit claiming that the school violated the IDEA's LRE mandate. So what evidence, just think to yourself for a second, what evidence do you think the school district would need to present in order to uphold their LRE decision? What sort of things would give them a strong defense in the parent's challenge to this case. Think about the elements for what could meet that threshold of disruptive force. Consider getting documentation on how much time the teacher or the paraprofessionals are having to spend with that student, and how that is taking away from the educational opportunities of other classmates. You can even potentially compare the performance of other classmates with other students at that grade level to see how they are progressing compared to the rest of their peers in other educational settings. Maybe talk about whether the students in that classroom are having concerns or issues with being in the same classroom with someone having disruptive behavior. Are they having to reach out to the school counselor, or are they having to deal with coping mechanisms? If you can document, the more you can document, the stronger your defense will be if you get challenged on an LRE decision here. And then also potentially documenting, as it says in the example here, the hitting of classmates and the pulling of hair. How often is that occurring? So if you do document along the way and you are confident in your decision, you should feel confident in defending it if it does get challenged. So here, if the LEA does present strong enough evidence to show the confidence in their decision, the parent's claim would likely not succeed. The school's decision could be upheld because while IDEA does favor those inclusive settings, courts have ruled that severe behaviors and that lack of progress that she was showing, that's another thing that you can show evidence of, that she's not, the student is not reaching their IEP annual goals and not anticipated to reach them, and just not showing that behavioral or academic progress that you could justify being in a general education setting. So therefore, here a more restrictive placement could be justified. These restricted environment decisions do allow removal. Schools can use those more restrictive placements when the general education is not appropriate and it's not succeeding with those supports. And you'll see in a second the case that this hypothetical comes from, the amount of supports that the student did have. And LRE, as I mentioned earlier, is not absolute. The student can be moved back from a more restrictive environment to the general education setting if possible. Schools need to provide that access to general education unless the student's needs are requiring that more intensive support to succeed. So other things you can document are, have you conducted an FBA? Have you instituted a VIP? How is the student responding to those accommodations? Are they making progress? Document that either yes or no. And just along the way, some things that Robert mentioned earlier about getting that parental input, going through all those steps and documenting as much as possible. And our example comes from a Knox County case, and in this case, Knox County did a fantastic job of documenting everything that was happening. So much so that if I had fit it all on the slide, the font would have been way too small for to be even legible. It's small as is right here, and I did not get to put half the things on there. But in this instance, from this case, Knox County documented over 50 instances of groping and hitting staff during a single day. The student was throwing scissors and magnets at other students and even pushed down a student with a degenerative brain disease. The student was spitting on classmates, pulling hair, so often that when other students walked by, they would put up their hoods to make sure that the student wouldn't spit on them or pull their hair. And several of the classmates were so anxious about being in that educational environment with the student. They had to speak to the school counselor about coping mechanisms, and it was clearly distracting from their educational opportunities and their ability to obtain FAPE. So on most days, the school also needed 4 to 5 employees in that one classroom to teach both that student with disabilities and the rest of the classmates, including 2 paraprofessionals strictly for that student. So in this case, Knox County did such a great job of documenting all of the reasons why they believe the student was being too disruptive, reaching that threshold of the disruptive force to be removed from the classroom to a more restrictive environment. And that's, the court upheld their decision on this case. Is there any other documentation or questions, Rob, you think that would have helped also the LEA's defense here?
I think they did pretty much a very exemplary job. That could be a model for what other districts could do when they see things going in that direction. I'll just reiterate, we might have mentioned this already too. Also in the context of an IEP team meeting, to always document the decision making process in the prior written notice clearly, what was recommended, what was decided upon, what was decided against. I can share that as an investigator, when we are doing investigations with any allegation, but especially with determinations made in the IEP team meeting context, we always look at or I always do, look at the prior written notice or notices associated with that process first. And districts tend to, they can defend their decisions much better if they're clearly documented in those prior written notices. So that's kind of an answer, Tate, but sort of I'm just stealing some time to tell everybody to make sure you do your PWNs well.
I think that's great. PWNs are so important, not documenting just what you decide, but also the why. The why is super important. And those are the kinds of things that our investigators like Rob, Trish, and Dana, when they're reaching out to you, if we get complaints, this is the type of data that Knox County put together here and documented that would help us in making our decisions. So that's our key takeaway from today. We've got time for questions if anybody's got any. I think we've got about 8 or 9 more minutes left, so we got through this pretty quickly. The slideshow was planned when we're usually conversing in person, so that's why it's, I think, coming in a little short today. But does anybody have any questions while we still have time here? Or we can jump to an early lunch. And again, if you do have questions that come up later, please feel free to reach out to me at my email, which is on the screen there, or our dispute resolution team, and we'll try to answer your questions as best as possible. But otherwise, if there are no questions.
Hey, Tate, can I jump in here real quick?
Please.
Hi, just a quick reminder. I know all of you on this call probably are aware, but we have a contract through Triad and our technical assistance network, TINTAN, and they are willing and able to essentially, as Tate and Taylor were talking about, exhausting those internal, external resources. If you have a case of a student who is presenting like the cases that Tate just defined or described, please reach out to us. I'm going to drop the QR code into the chat. And you can request any type of support, not just through complex behavior, but also through many of our other contracts. So if you're not aware and you need support for a specific student and you want to ensure that your FBA BIP is done appropriately, and or you just want to have other eyes on the FBA BIP, they have a number of service lines, even an FBA quick consult where you can come on and they can look at your FBA and say, hey, you might want to tweak it here, tweak it here. All of this will help you kind of bolster up that legally defensible position that Tate and Taylor were just talking about. So again, I'll drop the QR code and the link into the chat. I think Susan just did that for me. Thank you, Susan. And feel free to request any support that you need through that technical assistance network. Thanks, Tate.
Yeah, for sure. Triad out of Vanderbilt is one of the best options you can use. So thanks, April, for that. Again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to me in my email. Thanks, Rob, for joining me today, and enjoy the rest of y'all's day. Thanks.